And fortunately also, we have here with us, in addition to Dr. Amir Fuchs-Paz, we do have Amir Paz-Fuchs, or we do have Avital Birger, Dr. Avital Birger, as I've learned, Senior Deputy Legal Counsel of the Israeli Government Companies Authority. Now, she will not give a lecture, but she will respond to Amir's presentation. And fortunately also, I by myself, Micky, the moderator, am not a neutral person, I have to admit. I'm a convinced trade unionist. Therefore, it was important to me also to moderate specifically this panel. I by myself have worked for 6 years at the International Department of Histadrut, which is the umbrella organization of the Israeli trade union. And also as in the last 16 years as a project manager for the Ebert Foundation here in Israel, one of my main tasks is the cooperation with the trade unions. I also have asked the Histadrut to send a representative to this panel. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it. I think it's a little bit pity because it's always hard to talk about trade unions without hearing the authentic voice of a trade unionist. Anyhow, we have a little bit. We have about 2 hours, right? Yeah, we have about 2 hours, and
I won't take all the 2 hours.
Yeah, you won't. You will speak maximum, Amir, max 30 minutes, please. But let me take advantage of my position as a moderator and at the beginning tell you a little bit about the connection between the Ebert Foundation and trade unions. So we have the mandate of the German Confederation of Trade Unions to put in place projects which help strengthen independent, representative, pluralistic, and democratic trade unions in foreign countries, not only here in Israel, but in all over the world. In Israel, we, the Ebert Foundation, collaborate with the Histadrut, Israel's Trade Union Federation, its youth movement, and other partners to promote social justice, empower trade unions, analyze social policy, and improve the tripartite dialogue between employers, employees, and the state. Practically, in cooperation with Histadrut, we offer workshops for members of work councils on workers' rights and ways of organizing workers. International organizations like the ICFTU, International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, or the ILO, the International Labour Organization, are important partners in our work in Israel. We organize international seminars and conferences in order to discuss worldwide experiences on global issues like minimum labor standards or the concept of decent work and its implications on the Israeli labor market. Gender issues and women's rights are addressed as well in this context. And the last thing I want to say is in this context, one of our outstanding partners in this area is in the area of social justice, is the Leer Jerusalem Institute in general, the Center for Social Justice and Democracy in particular. For years now, really, many, many years, we cooperate with this institute and in the privatization and regulation project. And I want to take the opportunity to thank all the partners here, Yitzhak Galnor, Nomika, Amir Paz-Fuchs, and many, many others. Thank you for this nice, and Mehdi, of course, very important partnership. Okay, now I would like to introduce Amir Paz-Fuchs, who will talk about labor law in the era of privatization. Dr. Amir Paz-Fuchs is a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Sussex, which is in England, and a research fellow at the University of Oxford's Center for Social Legal Studies, which is also in England, right? Yeah. He earned his first magna cum laude degree, not summa cum laude, he's magna cum laude, which is the peak of, you can imagine. But you have to deliver now, after I've said this.
I can go.
Okay, and philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He wrote his doctoral thesis at the University of Oxford on welfare and labor programs. After completing his doctorate, he taught in the Faculty of Law at the Honor Academic College at the Faculty of Law in Tel Aviv University. Dr. Paz-Fuchs has published more than 20 articles on welfare and labor programs, social and economic rights, and legal aspects of privatizing social services. At the same time, he has headed 2 research projects. The first at Wolfson College. Wolfson College in Oxford studied the challenges of the welfare state in the 21st century. The second one, in collaboration with Professor Yitzhak Galnur at the Center for Social Justice and Democracy in memoriam of Yaakov Chazan, here at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, examines the state's responsibility and the limits of privatization. As part of this privatization project, Dr. Paz-Fuchs initiated the writing of an annual report on privatization and nationalizations in Israel, and is the co-author of this report. In addition, he is in charge of the project's policy papers. So, thank you very much for joining us. Amir, please, you have 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And again, it's one further for those feminists in the room, one further reminder that the private is political. And in this panel in particular, I was looking forward to exchanging ideas on labor and privatization. And as Micky read out what was the expected abstract for the Turkish colleague, what he was about to say, it rings even more unfortunate that he couldn't be here and against the tragic circumstances. I do hope that we'll manage to continue this dialogue, hopefully on the Bosphorus and meet again. Oh, I thought I could walk around. I like walking around. Then I have to walk with a microphone and with this, and I'll just stay here. I'll just stay here then. So I'd like to, in this talk, perhaps address 3 claims. I'm very thankful for Avital who could step in. Dr. Avital Berger, it's the first time that I think we can use, or she's heard this term in an academic conference, just recently received her doctorate. So I'm glad that she's delighted and thankful that she could step in. As was mentioned, she's the senior deputy legal advisor for the Israeli Government Corporations Authority. So that will enable me to say a bit less about government corporations privatization. Perhaps Avital would complete it, and I'll focus a bit more about outsourcing and contracting out. But in general, I'd like to address three claims and give the general background to labor in an era of privatization in Israel. Then talk somewhat, like I said, a bit less than I originally planned, on privatization of government assets and state-owned enterprises, and focus a bit more on outsourcing, contracting out in various aspects in Israel. And perhaps, if I have time, we'll see how Micky highlights it and signals me, say something about comparable issues in Europe and in England. So we'll have a kind of a broad comparison. I'd like to talk about the relationship between, this is one of my major interests, and as an interest, someone who has an interest in public services in general, to talk about the impact or the relationship, the link between labor, workers' rights, and the institutional issues that concern the social services in general, and how that feeds in labor issues to society in general and the institutions involved, so the public services and as a civil administration, and perhaps very tentatively, modestly, finish with some tentative recommendations. So, I promised 3 claims to start off with. The meta-claim, the general meta-claim for this presentation would be that there's a strong link between privatization of government assets, state-owned enterprises, and outsourcing and contracting out. And I say this because they're usually discussed separately by different people. There are different people who are, some people who are interested, and you saw this even in this workshop. There are different people who are interested in state-owned enterprises and privatization of state-owned enterprises, usually coming from public finances, usually coming from economics, and other people who are interested usually in outsourcing and contracting out, usually sociology, political science, and perhaps law. And I would like to say that there's a strong link between the two through the labor market and the implications on workforce, but that feeds in to society in general. The argument would be then that both policies exacerbate the segregation of the labor market and target weaker segments of the workforce. I did mention, preempting this talk yesterday, that there's a strong gender impact to this, and depending on the particular society, if we're talking about migrant workers, or if we're talking about immigration, recent immigrants to society, there's a stronger impact on them, or minorities perhaps in society, racial, ethnic minorities in society, feel the effects of privatization and outsourcing strongly than others. And finally, that both policies, proper privatization, straightforward privatization of government assets on the one hand and outsourcing and contracting out on the other hand, both policies endanger public institutions and public interests. The Yari Commission, a commission that was set up to study mainly welfare to work programs, and Ronen here was the secretary for the Yari Commission. Somewhere I used to know this. I think it's page 86, but now I'm not sure I can trust my memory on this. They had a box somewhere in the midst of the report with a surprising statement that now that I think of it, I think Ronen put it in there, and they didn't know this. It almost has nothing to do with the report in general, so probably he just inserted it in. And it says, over the past 2 decades, we find, this is a government commission, yeah? Over the past 2 decades, we find in Israel 2 separate markets for educated and non-educated. We can talk separately, perhaps, if the 2 labor markets are indeed educated and non-educated. We spoke a bit about skills and vocational skills, etc. yesterday, if that's what separates the 2. But this is a crucial point for this presentation. We talk about the labor market. We talk about the labor market and the workforce, etc., as if they're one. We constantly refer to the labor market, quote unquote. But in fact, there is actually, and almost everyone who has studied the labor markets over the past 40 years, since the late 1960s, has recognized that there are at least 2 labor markets, dual labor market theory or 2-tiered labor markets, and some have suggested that actually more. So within them, perhaps there's more divisions, gender, on the basis of gender, not only class, which is the classic one, but also labor protection, gender, race, ethnic, etc. But I'll focus on the dual labor market. For those who are unfamiliar, some people in the room are very familiar with this. The idea is that there's a primary labor market, which is characterized by occupational security, stability, and fringe benefits. So job security, not necessarily tenure. Tenure is a red herring to an extent. There's no such thing as someone who cannot be fired at all, ever, no matter what he or she does. There's no such thing in any place in the world. But the ease of dismissing someone changes, of course, from in today gone tomorrow to you have to go through a various set of procedures and hoops and agreements and panels, et cetera, so making it more difficult. So increased job security, fringe benefits. It's not really fringe. It could be pensions, it could be vacations, it could be various important things. Fringe is kind of a misnomer. And accidentally or not, Micky and I would probably argue that it's not accidentally that these are related to trade unions and collective agreements. In the primary sector, you find strong trade union representation and a protection through trade agreements. On the other hand, you have secondary labor markets, no protection by trade unions, and therefore employees have individualistic contracts and therefore limited bargaining power. And increasingly, Lili, we just spoke this about over lunch, they're talking about part-time, temporary, individual contracts, right? Whether they're directly employed or through agencies, these are people who have very precarious, which is, I guess, part of the lecture I was supposed to be given by my Turkish colleague, very precarious work. There's a very, very popular book now by Guy Standing, 2011, called The Precariat, obviously building on the proletariat, that the story is not the proletariat anymore, it's not working class versus entrepreneurs, it's the precariat, it's the people who are employed but in very precarious situations. So what are the two types of privatization that I highlighted? Just to clarify and to set this out, the first is selling government companies or state-owned enterprises and assets with the workers. So we sell the company with the workers. And the second is outsourcing and contracting out. And the idea here, of course, people here are very familiar, removing certain functions or personnel from the main organization which retains its public role. As I'll mention, there has been an argument, and we encountered the argument more than once in our research project whilst interviewing members, especially of the Ministry of Finance. Was Ruven here still? No. The Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Welfare, the Ministry of Health do not categorize outsourcing and contracting out as privatization. I'll talk more about this, but it should be highlighted. Obviously, we do see this privatization, but I should clarify why they don't, just to set out the argument. The argument is, first of all, they are publicly funded. This is not irrelevant. They are publicly funded through taxpayer, and many times, for better or for worse, lip services or not, the government sees itself as still responsible for it. Still, there's a factual, empirical argument what it does in that role. But the government, if you talk to members of the government, they do not see themselves. We just had spoke about education. We had yesterday a panel about health. They do not see themselves as privatizing out health and education services. They say, actually, we are still responsible. We're just delivering the service. It's almost technical. We're simply delivering the service through private organization. We're funding it, and we're actually, the argument has been said, we're even more responsible now. We don't have to bother with the delivery of the service. We can focus on being responsible service and supervising the role. Why is this done? Why is this done? As ever, and throughout the workshop, this could have come up, but it's particularly the case when we talk about the workers. These are two quotes from, it should be noted, proponents of privatization in Israel. So academics who describe privatization in Israel and who are advocates of privatization, who are generally in favor of privatization. So this is not a critique of privatization. And what they say is, in Israel, privatization is part of a general process to promote efficiency. Now, insofar as, especially with regards to the selling off of state-owned enterprises, of government companies, what we mean by efficiency, and I think it's nice to unpack what we mean by terms. what we mean by public responsibility, what we mean by public responsibility, what we mean by efficiency. Efficiency in the narrow sense means doing more with less. I actually asked my students, what do we think we are talking, what are we talking about when talking about efficiency? And what we mean, I thought you'd be writing this down. I was wondering what you'd have to say. Experts on public finance should have something to say about this. Efficiency in a narrow sense means more with less. So in the labor market, this means redundancies, meaning doing the same thing with less people. Or, of course, doing more with the same amount of people. But what we saw in Israel, and I've looked at World Bank reports, the phenomenon is a global phenomenon comparable in the water sector in Argentina, in the electricity sector in Brazil, and elsewhere. Mass redundancies. Sometimes up to 60, 70, 80% of people becoming unemployed following privatization.
Where?
All over. So we could have the Shechem, for example. I would have probably intended to give that later. So the Shechem, which is actually a chain, it's strange to say, a chain of department stores owned by the Ministry of Defense. It's strange to say this, but that's actually what it was, mainly for army personnel, was privatized. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe the army shouldn't own department stores like supermarkets, right? But 3,000 out of 4,300, 3,000 out of 4,300 people lost their jobs immediately after privatization. In the water sector in Argentina, again, 60, 70% lost their jobs following privatization of water sector in Argentina. And indeed, this is specifically a quote from Eckstein, again, another privatization expert in Israel, proponent of privatization, but you have exactly the same thing in World Bank reports. Again, World Bank that are in favor of privatization, but they're saying very similar things. The wide process of privatization has led in almost all countries to a rise in unemployment. This is not a critique of privatization. This is a statement led by proponents of privatization, something that we have to deal with, we have to consider. They're not saying necessarily it's a good thing, but it's a statement of fact. The World Bank, in one of its reports, I don't have it with me, but it's quoted it so many times, I think I can remember it. It's something along the lines that workers have the most to lose from process of privatization. Workers are, as a cohort, the body that has the most to lose from a process of privatization. So I think we're well placed to ask, what is the price of privatization and who pays it? We spoke generally, I think, the focus when we speak about public services is generally about the consumers or the clients or the citizen, as you will, the client of the services, the sick, the elderly, the people in care, the students. But there are people within these organizations who pay a massive price, or are obviously the people who are no longer in these organizations because they have lost their jobs because of that. In addition, furthermore, society pays a price due to mass unemployment. Pays a price, obviously, because you have people who are redundant, who are reliant now on state benefits. But unemployment is a has a massive role in social distress. It's the number one, here's a nice thought, it's the number one motivation, non-health related motivation for suicide. Number one cause for a non-health related cause for suicide, and for depression, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. So unemployment is something that society should be concerned about. And if privatization leads to mass unemployment or to a rise in unemployment, it's something that society should be discussing, I think. So why is this happening? Why is this happening? We've interviewed in the course of our research people who were in charge of privatization. And with respect to the selling off of state-owned enterprises, I'm treading carefully because Avital is here. One thing that we came across is that for some, a major motivation is the selling off of is the breaking of trade unions. Selling off state-owned enterprises because in state-owned enterprises you had a strong presence of trade unions. And selling off these enterprises into the private sector would allow much more easily to break trade unions and to weaken the power. This is crucial because, as you will well know, trade union in general, ILO conventions, international conventions, but also, those of you who are not familiar, in Israel, in domestic law in Israel, is a recognized right. The right to establish and protect trade unions is recognized by law and by the courts, by the labor courts in Israel. And therefore, motivation to break trade unions is inherently suspect, and I would argue even illegal. More ideologically, Otto von Freund, probably the grandfather of British labor law, said that labor law is designed to deal with situations of inherent imbalance of bargaining power that exists between in the individual relationship. He continues to say that collective agreements rebalance that power. So there's an inherent imbalance of bargaining power between the individual and the employer when there's no trade union, and when there is a trade union, the two are relatively, generally seen as of equal bargaining power. And yet, Yitzhak Rabin, when trade unions protested against privatization, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin said, and this is a horrible time to use this quote, I do apologize for it on both sides, that he's not worried about trade unions' objection to privatization, just as he wasn't worried about terrorist groups who wish to derail the peace process. I turn your attention to the analogy. Trade unions are like terrorists, and the peace process is like privatization. The peace process is like privatization. And it's part of the demonization of trade unions that constantly object and are stand in the way of public goods and good public ends. Now, the former head, I will caveat what I'll say in a second, but I should say the former head of the Prime Minister's office, Uri Yogev, and I'm not sure about this, but he's the current head of the Government Companies Authority. Yes, he is. Yes. Yeah. Uri Yogev said that in his interview, departing his previous role as head of the Prime Minister's office, he said that his main success was breaking collective agreements in Israel, breaking trade union power in Israel, and his main failure, by the way, he continued to say, was not breaking the teachers' union. Right? That's the only thing that he wished he could have still done. Now, Avital is sitting here, and I must say that I interviewed her and her boss, and they expressed the opinion that these opinions exist, but they're definitely not shared by everyone in the government company authority. So some have different motivations. We should be aware of that. Different people have different motivations. Not all share this rationale. I'll run through these and say what can be the effect of the selling off of state-owned enterprises, and this perhaps is a counterpoise to Micky Aran's intervention early on about the importance of selling off of government enterprises. Studies are at least ambivalent about what happens to government corporations when they're sold off. It's not a clear picture, and different sectors have different impacts. But what you can see, there have been empirical studies, including by the World Bank. Again, not a strong critique of privatization, to say the least. That before privatization happens, or after privatization happens, it's actually the good people who leave. So people who joined the government company because of the security and are actually saying, now, if I have to work for the private sector, they have the opportunity to choose where they want to work for. So it's the good people who are now following the change. They're being sold with the company. Like, if I need to work for a private sector, I want to choose who I can work for. It's the people who have the opportunity who actually leave, and the company's often stuck, quote unquote, with the people who have no choice but to stay there and who won't have options anywhere else. It actually makes sense, but there's also empirical proof to that effect. On society at large, like I said, there's mass redundancy. Usually when governments are sold off, there's an agreement with the buyer that the government actually does this usually before it's bought. It creates the mass redundancy. It dismisses a large majority of the workforce. These are people in their 40s and their 50s who won't find jobs anywhere else. So we're talking about rise in unemployment. Expanding the dependency rate. For those of you who are familiar with pensions, we have an increasing problem with pensions. Less and less people are supporting more and more people on pensions. But now you have people who get early retirement due to privatization. People who are now retired and will not work anymore since they're 45. So you have less people working and more people on pensions already. The flexibility is not for the workers, it's for the employers. I'll talk about demutualization, which is an important concept. It's now gaining prominence in British labor law. I'll talk about that when I talk about outsourcing and contracting out and widening inequality. Okay, I'll push forward. The impact on a marginalized group. What I want to stress that in both cases, both with the selling off of state-owned enterprises and with contracting out and outsourcing, there's a particular impact on marginalized group. It doesn't affect all workers the same way. We move to a free market, but we're not all free. The market is free, but we're not. And people who require more protection, who had more protection, are now suffer the brunt of the free market, are more likely to suffer the brunt of the free market. Why? Because people who work for the public service, the public sector, for example, just to give one small example, don't have it here, under the Equality Act 2010 in Britain, there's something called the public sector duty. The public sector is committed to heightened obligations of equality, higher obligations of equality than the private sector. In Israel, formally, the public sector is committed to affirmative action. It's committed to affirmative action while the private sector is not. So the public sector in general, the public sector in general is committed more, its public sector is committed more to provide a proper work-life balance, allowing more women, for example, to balance work and life outside work. However, once you have less and less jobs in the public sector, that means there are less and less places that are committed to equality and protection, etc., for those workers. Again, higher, I mentioned people with disabilities, higher affirmative action responsibilities for people with disabilities. Moreover, studies have shown that women, minorities, etc., are those who are likely to be more likely to be made redundant, be dismissed during privatization. They're likely to be people suffering from privatization. Moving on to outsourcing, Yitzhak mentioned this, so I'll just rush through this. There were arguments in the past, and like I said, within Israeli argument, within Israeli government, it still exists this argument that outsourcing is not privatization. I want to put it straightforward to you that we think that outsourcing is privatization. I think it should be readily asserted and acknowledged that it's a different form of privatization, and the fact that the government still funds the services is not immaterial, and yet it is privatization. Moreover, one could even perhaps say, somewhat conspirationally, that it's selective privatization. You don't privatize all the sector, you only privatize parts of it. You don't deal with the stronger elements, you deal with the weaker elements, as I mentioned, and I'll mention in a bit. So let's say I can privatize or outsource those sectors of the economy with more women in them. I can privatize those sectors of the economy where the trade union is weaker. I don't deal with those sectors of the public administration where there's a strong trade union representation. Just focus on the weaker elements. It's really interesting that these things are ongoing in Israel. despite the fact that even within Israeli government, officials have recognized the harms of privatization. So this is not us only. It's not only the activists here in the room who have been shouting from the rooftops. People within government in the highest level have published reports. State Controller or Israeli Accountant General have repeatedly published that not one contractor followed the law. They actually at times checked what happens to workers being outsourced. Not one contractor followed the law. Now, no doubt, we fell short in the course of our privatizations. They call this privatizations, right? The outsourcing. Danielle, you asked about criminal or corruption yesterday. We found a criminal culture in government procurement. These are two different people, by the way. Two subsequent accountant generals, one after the other. Different reports. We found a criminal culture in government procurement. Companies that violate labor laws and workers' rights increase their chances to win bids and are not sanctioned. The system has deepened poverty and inequality, lessened the motivation to move from welfare to work. It also hurt the level of public services because workers who are not happy, workers who are disenfranchised, you get a lower level of workers because they all know what to expect. The good workers move into the private sector. You get a less and less level of workers. I'm going to push forward in terms of flexibility and just to say, okay, but this is important and it's very, very common across Europe, this whole discourse of flexibility. Why are they doing this? And the idea is government sector is rigid is bad, flexible is good. People go to do yoga not because they want to be rigid, but because they want to be flexible. Flexible is good. What are we talking about? Or Pilates. Sorry, Domika. People do yoga, Pilates. There are two types of flexibility here. Two types of flexibility. One is vis-a-vis government, vis-a-vis the contractor. If the contractor doesn't do its job, then we can dismiss him. The second level of flexibility is between the contractor and the workers. Contractor is there, but he or she is not happy with Lily, so goodbye, Lily. Which you couldn't do, of course, if there's job security. What's the reality? The reality is there's no flexibility between government and the contractors. Government does not sanction contractors, and it does not dismiss them unless there's pressure from below. But contractors have failed time after time after time, and they're still not been dismissed. The Health Ministry's position delivered to the State Controller in 2009 asked to be relieved from a duty to procure the services. Why? Because it had already engaged with one contractor, and it said, the Health Ministry said, it's called the Organization for Health Services, Agudat Shirutei Briut, Organization for Health Services, should be given a single supplier status. We don't want any competition. So the whole idea is competition. We don't want competition since the Organization for Health Services has acquired vast medical and paramedical knowledge. It knows more than we do. It knows more than we do, that organization, and thus its operational power has expanded into the de facto sole supplier of these services. Can I highlight, please? This is not a critique of the privatization. This is the Ministry of Health saying why it's important to continue to have this private provider provide the service, because we don't know how to provide the services anymore. We're completely dependent on them. No flexibility whatsoever. I'll take a few more minutes. Sorry. Not much more, I promise. Not a few more minutes. I want to say something about the law. There's something that Ronen and I in an article referred to explicitly or implicitly as a tragedy of unintended consequence. I'm not saying the government wants this, but this is what's happening. to agency workers. Here's the process. Agency workers sue the end user. The end user is the health service, right? They say, I'm an agency worker, or I'm a contract teacher, and I'm suing the school to be recognized as directly employed by the school. Lily knows something about this, right? I'm employed through an agency, but I want to be recognized, or the care home, I want to be recognized as directly employed. They go to court. What does the labor court do? What the labor court does is say, how close are you to the school? If the school is involved with your day-to-day, if it tells you what to do on a regular basis, and if you, on the other hand, come to all the parties, all the meetings, if you have a desk at the school, if you have a closet, then we will find that the agency relationship is fictitious, and you will be recognized as employed directly by the school, okay, or by the care home, etc. That's what they do, and quite a few of them won. Quite a few agency workers have won and have been recognized as directly employed. What did the employers do? Say, okay, we read the judgments now, so what do we do now? The employers start to create a distance between them and the workers. So what you have, and this is why it really is tragic. It really, really is tragic. Employers now, agency workers, are not invited to meetings. I just added this just now after Lily's words. Cannot be promoted. If Lily could have been promoted internally, applied for deputy headmaster's job, then they would say, oh, that means that you were originally employed by the school. We can't have that. We'll create a distance between you and the school, create a distance between you and the municipality. They're not invited to staff parties. They're not giving gifts on holidays. They're not invited to field trips, to year-long meetings, etc. They have no fridge benefits. They can't use the canteens. They can't use the sports facilities. They have no gym membership, etc., etc. Create a distance between them. Why? Because if in a year's time they'll sue, we can say, no, 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 they're separate. And what does the government do?
Yeah.
It supervises less because, again, they don't want to be recognized as government employees. The government doesn't want them to be recognized as government. So the government supervises less and regulates less their employment. The result is overrepresentation of marginalized workers amongst agency workers, circumventing equality, affirmative action, and public sector duties. I'm running through this. I'm running. Sorry. Quite often, sorry, I'm going to go this way. What we have is a loss of organizational control. Yeah, and
thank you, Amir.
and more expensive services, and we have more expensive services. Circumventing civil services and loss of social measure.
It's a sign of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.